Hello everyone, welcome to Soil Sessions, a webinar series by the Soil Health Partnership. Thank you for joining us. I'm John Mesko, the Development Director for the Soil Health Partnership, and I'm glad you're here. Let me just share with you a little bit about the relationship that the Soil Health Partnership has with the Nature Conservancy. In my role, I get to work with many organizations who support our work and want to help extend what we're doing far and wide. The Nature Conservancy was a handful of thoughtful organizations that came together a few years ago, identifying a need for farm-generated and farmer-focused knowledge to help understand soil health practices and their benefits, with the goal of fostering broader adoption on row crop acres across the U.S. In the Nature Conservancy, the Soil Health Partnership has a partner with decades of experience identifying and promoting solutions to the world's most important challenges. And at SHP, our mission is to reach wide-scale adoption of soil health building practices for the benefit of farmers and rural communities. One of the most important relationships in agriculture is that of the landowner with their farming operator. Each are vital to the goals and aspirations of the other, and both parties are critically important to understanding and advancing these solutions with the potential to not only increase the sustainability of farms, but to actually improve the environmental conditions for everyone. Now, the Nature Conservancy has some interesting work on how farmers and non-operating landowners can work together on these issues, and we're happy to provide an opportunity for the whole community to learn more. And with that, I'd like to introduce Randy Dell and Mike Dunn with the Nature Conservancy to start this soil session.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Randy Dell, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing over the past year and a half or so related to non-operating landowners with my colleague, Mike Dunn, who I'll introduce a little bit later. So non-operating landowners is an area that not a lot is known about. So there was a survey or a study by the USDA in the mid-90s, a follow-up one in late 2000s or 2014. And in addition to some research studies, primarily by extension, we don't really know a lot about who these folks are, how they make management decisions, how they value their land, how they work with their farmer. And as we'll talk a little bit more about here this morning, they control a lot of farmland in the Midwest and across the U.S. And there is a lack or less adoption of conservation practices on these rented farmland. So when we talk about non-operating landowners, just to clarify what we're talking about, who we're talking about, I think a lot of people initially presume the absentee landowner, the farmer that lives out of state in the city, a few generations removed. And that is a portion of the non-operating landowner population, but it includes retired farmers, spouses who still live on the land itself, people who live in the state still have a connection to agriculture. There is no average non-operating landowner. And just as there's no average non-operating landowner, there's a lot of different ownership structures too, and this influences and impacts how management decisions are made and how the land is valued and taken care of. And just to give an example here are the different ownership structures in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. So there is still the majority or a majority in each of the states is the individual who owns the land, but there are a lot of ownership structures like trusts and family corporations who have, again, some different guiding principles and requirements in how the land is managed. So this, again, influences what the opportunities are for engaging landowners on conservation and how those practices can be implemented. And one factor, too, is trust ownership. And this is a growing trend looking at the data from Iowa from their rural survey that's growing over time. And as more families are further removed from the land, from farming, a trend that's likely going to grow. So rather than trying to work with maybe one non-operating landowner, there's a family, multiple landowners, there's a trustee, and it's a little bit more complicated, obviously. So why do we care about this, or why are we talking about non-operating landowners? So on the left here, you'll see the blue map of the U.S. The dark blue is counties that have 60% or more of farmland is rented. So as we look at north central Iowa, most of Illinois, central Indiana, along the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, most of this farmland is rented out. And then when we look at the practice or the adoption of various conservation practices with no-till maybe as the most widely accepted or adopted soil health practice, you can see an inverse correlation between the highly rented farmland, the dark blue. So again, not to pick on Iowa, but north central Iowa, a lot of rented farmland. We see very low adoption of no-till. So there's other factors involved like soil types, crop cycles, and all that. But this is a pretty striking illustration of the challenge here. And the data for cover crops nationwide, we're looking at 3 to 4 or 5% adoption of cover crops. So the pattern and the trend's a little bit less obvious. But a recent survey, the 2018 Iowa Rural Life Survey, found that of farmers surveyed for that project, 42% indicated they were less likely to plant cover crops on rented farmland. So there are some challenges here and some opportunities. So one of the things that TNC did when we started looking at how we can help address some of these challenges here is we reached out to American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust has been active in non-operating landowners, particularly women landowners, for quite some time. And they also saw the need for getting more information on who these people are. What is the population of these absentee non-operating landowners? What's the percentage of local? How do the conservation attitudes vary? And how can we develop and provide tools to help landowners work with their farmers to put conservation practices in place where appropriate? So we helped TNC with funding from FFAR, the Food Foundation Agriculture Research Program, with Soil Health Partnership and some other funders, to help implement the survey in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And I'll talk a little bit about the results from the study, but the survey was designed primarily by Peg Petrozolka at Utah State, previously with Iowa State, and Jen Filiapak at American Farmland Trust. So just kind of high-level demographics, and this is consistent with some of these variables that are pulled from the USDA survey, the total survey from 2014, as well as some of the land grant extension surveys. Not surprising, non-operating landowners are a little bit older on average than the nationwide average for farmers. They're mostly retired. What was a little bit surprising to us is the percentage that live on farmland, still pretty high percentage. And then average farmland owned, the landowners owned a considerable or a sizable amount of land, about 200 acres across 3 states. And partly what's relevant for our discussion here and exploration of conservation opportunities is the lease characteristics. So as we know, a lot of these are verbal handshake agreements, and there's a very high level of trust and very deep tied relationships between landowners and farmers. So as we look at practices that maybe have multi-year payoffs or take multi-years to implement, having a verbal lease presents some challenges, particularly when they're annual, renewed year-to-year leases. Even though there is that long-term strong relationship, that introduces some uncertainty. And where this data varies a little bit from some of the other data sources is the cash rent. I think in general, the trend is increasing over time in most locations, moving towards cash rent. And obviously there's some regional variances where crop share is a little bit more common. And then another thing that was a little bit surprising to us was the experience with farming from the non-operating landowners. So the majority here either were a farm operator themselves or they grew up on a farm, so they still have that strong relationship. And a few of the takeaways from this data is that landowner-farmer relationship is really strong. The data really shows this. So when landowners were asked, who do you trust for important conservation information, their farmer was clear and far away the most important source. 80% indicated that they were very important. I think USDA, Extension, soil water conservation districts were about 50%. So there was a big jump. The farmer is who they're looking to for conservation information. And then when they were asked to rank various attributes of what makes a good farm operator, maintaining soil productivity was in the top 2 or 3 across the 3 I states. Amount of rental pay per acre, surprisingly, was down towards the bottom. They still, rent is important. They need to get the check. But as far as the attributes of what makes a good farmer to them, that was less important than their ability to take care of the land. And then again, that commitment to their farmer, 87% indicated that they're committed to their farmer continuing to farm their land. They don't want to change their operator. They trust them. They want to see them succeed. And the average number of years that they'd been working with their farmer was 16. And this was, again, consistent across the 3 I states, Illinois and Indiana. I think the average was 17 years, actually. So again, very deep, trusted, long-term relationships. So then we look at the land characteristics and the tenure of these landowners. These are multi-generation land holdings. There's a deep connection to the land itself as well, with over 40% indicating that the land had been in their family for 70 plus years. So we looked at financial motivations. I'm looking at the net farm income across the 3 states here. Again, given the amount of acres they were leasing out, about 200 acres, maybe the dollar amounts aren't super surprising, but they're making income, but not necessarily a big fortune. And then we asked about what is the financial motivation for owning land. So again, immediate income was the primary concern. About 70% or 80%, excuse me, across 3 states indicated that immediate income was the most important reason, whether as a primary source of income or non-primary source. They could select multiple categories here. So immediate income is the main one, but there's also long-term real estate investment interests and then estate planning purposes as well. So when we asked, if you value soil health, you value working with your farmer, and you value your farmer, what kind of actions would you be willing to do to maybe put some additional soil health practices on your land? And then generally, landowners indicated that they agree or strongly agree with statements such as, I'm comfortable asking my operator to use certain conservation practices on my land. They're comfortable extending the lease to accommodate conservation practices. They're comfortable amending or making requirements in their lease for certain conservation practices. When it gets a little bit more specific about soil erosion control and to conserve and improve soil health, still a majority are comfortable talking with their farmer about that, but a little bit less so than just kind of in general talking about conservation practices on their land. And one of the takeaways for me here is that they generally think or don't know what conservation practices are being implemented on their land. They trust their farmer. They think they're doing a good job. They assume that they're doing the most conservation and soil health management on their land that's possible. But there's a high degree of uncertainty. They don't really know what's good. They don't know what's going on. But again, they trust their operator to make good conservation decisions. 94% agree or strongly agree with that statement. So the takeaway for me is that they value soil health. They're willing to do things to work with their farmer to make it easier to put these practices in place. They just don't know what's needed. They're really looking to their farmer to guide them and educate them on what those opportunities might be. And don't worry about reading all the text here, but when we ask them what is their interest in various conservation resources, and as you can see, the majority are not at all interested. So they're not interested in conservation resources. 60% indicating they're not interested in joining a peer group or joining some kind of learning group like that. Working with a private business that specializes in providing conservation services, 62% not interested. Where we saw a little bit more interest was just kind of basic information. So having access to education materials expressly for non-operating landowners, 40% were somewhat interested in that. And having access to leasing tools to better account for costs, benefits, and timelines of implementing conservation practices. Again, not a high level of very strong interest, but a little bit more interest compared to some of the other options that were provided. So I'll talk about some other research, but I think one of the takeaways here is that they're looking for an easy button. They care about conservation, they care about soil health, they're willing to make some changes. They just don't want to make a big commitment. If it's an opportunity is presented to them to put these practices in place, it's kind of a low hurdle for participation. They're willing to do those types of practices and work with their farmer to do that. And another project that TNC was involved with, along with Purdue University, Linda Prokopi and her lab, Renee Ranjan, and then also Johns Hopkins University and Colin Weigel, who's on the call here today. We initiated really a kind of a trial experiment with landowners in the 3 Midwestern I states, where we obtained addresses and contact information from Farm Market ID. We administered these postcards here in the middle that had various messages and framing of messages related to soil health. Some focused on the economic aspect, some focused on the legacy aspect, and both kind of a positive and negative framing, as well as just a general information, what is soil health. And landowners who filled out those postcards indicated they were interested in learning more about soil health, were recruited into a trial program where they were offered 3 different treatments. One was a soil health packet. They all received a soil health packet, which had information on contacts, soil health resources within their state, some of the scientific and overview information of different soil health practices. Others received a lease addendum that they could use if they wanted to put cover crops on one of their fields or in their fields in that year. And then another subset received a financial incentive, $1,500 if they were to plant cover crops in at least 40 acres of their farmland in 2018. So what we learned of the message testing, we had 9 to 12 response rate, which is pretty good, my understanding, for mailings of this type. The economic messages resonated the least. They had the lowest response rate, and the highest response rate was, what is soil health? So just kind of the basic information. Of the interventions tested, the financial offer was not particularly popular. Only about 3% enrolled or accepted that offer to put cover crops, and then that worked out to about $40 an acre, so comparative with, I think, some of the other cost share programs out there. So I think a few of the takeaways here is that, one, financial incentives aren't maybe the biggest driver. I mean, money obviously always matters, but it's not that maybe the biggest barrier to putting these practices on rented farm ground. And I'll talk a little bit more about, kind of what the opportunities might be. And another takeaway was that we saw or heard on various farm message boards that landowners had taken this and presented to their farmer and said, what do we do with this? So again, they're really trusting, looking to their farmer to provide information on what's viable for their farmland. And as a follow-up for this project, the research team did surveys with people who submitted the postcards that were interested in soil health but did not participate in the trial program itself. And just from receiving that soil health packet, 23% indicated that as a result of receiving that packet, they'd worked with one of their tenants to plant cover crops in 2018 on their land. So again, that's just receiving a packet about soil health. 23% talked to their operator, their farmer, and utilized cover crops in that year. A little bit of uncertainty. The majority still said no, but that's a pretty low cost outreach and education opportunity with a pretty big return. And then when we asked, any other actions you took as a result of receiving that soil health packet, 55%, 56% indicated they spoke with their tenant about using cover crops. So again, they had this packet, raised the issue of soil health and things they could do. And they spoke with their tenant about what can work on their land. 53% spoke with a family member about cover crops. So again, you have these different ownership structures. They're talking to their maybe co-owners or advisors on what kind of practice or if cover crops are viable for their land. And then about 15 to 20% took different steps as far as reaching out to extension, looking at maybe cost share, some of their lease amendments, things like that. So there was follow-up action from just receiving a pretty detailed but just kind of general overview of cover crops, soil health that landowners took and did some follow-up. So I think one of the things that we're moving towards is that really it's farmers, and I left off some other work that we've been doing here, but there's this these social dynamics are really strong. So farmers, they're utilizing these practices on the ground that they own and operate on. We're not seeing a lot of that transfer to rented farmland, and there's a reluctance to maybe raise or bring some of these practices or questions to their landowner. They don't want to disrupt what they see as a good relationship. And the same part in the landowner, they don't want to offend or upset their farmer. So there's kind of this detente where they're not talking about, what practices might be viable and, what it might take to get those practices implemented on their rented ground. So one of the initiatives that TNC is working on with Trust in Food, a farm journal initiative, is doing some message testing and communication outreach to farmers through farm journals media outlets. And one of the initial things that Trust in Food did was held some focus groups this spring and early summer across Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And similar to the results from, I think, the survey and the trial project, both parties prefer written leases. They don't want to rock the boat. So there's just certainty and more comfort with the written lease, but they don't want to jeopardize or this kind of social contract they have now, these handshake agreements. Both farmers and landowners see soil health as the farmer's responsibility, whereas structural practices are more the responsibility of the landowner. And they see a need for just tangible tools, calculators, handouts on what these practices are, how they work, what are the agronomic benefits, what are the economic benefits, environmental benefits, et cetera. So what they identified as barriers to practice adoption, I should mention that the landowners and farmers who were surveyed as part of this were a pretty diverse group of farmers and landowners. So it wasn't just a particular type of landowner. But the barriers they see are local suitability of the practice, either the weather, the soils maybe aren't suitable for a particular practice, the farmer's equipment, And this, I think, jumps out in a lot of the tillage data. The farmer is not equipped to do cover crops or no-till or conservation till. If they're leasing just 100 acres or 200 acres from one landowner, it doesn't really justify maybe, purchasing new equipment on the lease length, and then just the economics of the practices. So this really kind of underscores the importance of partnerships like the Soil Health Partnership, where we're kind of building that evidence base and demonstrating how these practices can benefit farmers and landowners. So where we're at with this project is that Farm Trust and Food is going to start doing some ads in some of the publications starting in September through December of this year. There'll be email and online ads, as well as some content for some farm shows. So really targeting farmers, and the message is conservation conversations with your landowner are easier than you think. Landowners care about soil health. They're looking to hear from you on how these practices can be best implemented on their land. And with a link to a website with some additional resources that farmers and landowners can look at as far as maybe ways to initiate these conversations and how these practices are suitable for where they're at. So initially I showed the map of the rented farmland, very dark blue, a lot of rented farmland, the relatively low adoption of no-till, at least in 2012 in those same areas, where it shows maybe there's some challenges in figuring out how to put these practices on rented farm ground. But if you look at tile drainage, there's a very strong overlap between, again, different practices, different benefits and economic values and all that. But farmers and landowners figured out how to put tile drainage on rented land. We have, I think, pretty clear data and economics on the benefits of tile drainage for landowners, in these locations. And we're building that data set now for soil health. So, there's hope. As we think about incentives and how to engage landowners, a lot of times people think if you can improve soil health, obviously that benefits their land, which it does. But how we capture that value is challenging. With appraisals, soil is generally a static attribute. We can't really account for soil health and relative improvements in the soil. Even if we have robust soil health data, the ability to influence land values relative to interest rates, commodity prices, development pressures are generally much stronger than soil health improvements themselves. And then as we saw from the survey data, people obviously want to get a good return on their assets and their land, but the financial objectives for a lot of these landowners, it's legacy and minimizing tax obligations. They're not necessarily trying to sell land. I think in the USDA survey from 2014, the total survey, like less than 10% indicated they were going to sell, or when their plans for transitioning their land, less than 10% indicated they were going to sell in the open market. Most are going to transition it to a relative to either continue farming or renting. And then another argument that sometimes gets raised is if we can, improve soil health, there's an opportunity maybe to adjust rents to accommodate that. But with cash rents, the growers are really incurring all that risk of input costs. So there's not necessarily a direct economic benefit to the landowner if farmers are able to reduce their input costs from improving their soil health. And then reducing variability and yield improvements. And everyone wants to get high yields, obviously, and a good return, but the availability of crop insurance products, farmers can manage that to a certain extent. So as we look at maybe different incentives, different ways, maybe there's an opportunity to create income tax credits or other tax incentives for landowners who are co-investing or investing in the soil health of their land. Before I turn over to Mike, though, one other point I want to make is that all these projects point to landowners want to hear from their farmer. They trust their farmer. They're their conservation advisor. And it's really an opportunity for kind of scalable impact too. So looking at the percentage of non-operating landowners in Illinois, and the distributions are pretty similar across Iowa and Indiana. There's a lot of non-operating landowners who control a relatively small portion of farmland. So about 85% of the non-operating landowners control about 40% of the non-operating landowner farmland in the state of Illinois. So, as a farmer, you work with multiple landowners, obviously. There's an opportunity to kind of scale the use of these benefits of these practices. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Mike Dunn.
Perfect. Thank you, Randy. This is Mike Dunn. Good morning, everybody. I lead up our freshwater conservation work out of the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and I'm based out of Indianapolis. And I want to take a little step back just from Randy's presentation about why TNC is involved in this work or why we're pursuing projects like this, and then outline a little bit about what some of the future work or future steps we have before us related to the non-operating landowner efforts. So for some of you that might not be familiar with the Nature Conservancy, it is America's original land trust that was started back in the 1950s. We're present in all 50 states, and we are active in about 72 countries. And we have a vision of where people and nature will both thrive in the future. And one of our main efforts that we're trying to accomplish is providing food and water sustainably for a growing human population. Trying to build resilient systems, that is the beauty of the soil health effort. We're one of the original partners of the Soil Health Partnership that was initiated about 5 years ago. And really over the last decade, what this is it's a picture of the Mississippi watershed. This has long been an effort that the Nature Conservancy has been working on. Again, we are trying to protect, restore, and manage the special places for biodiversity and habitat around the world. That includes even right here in Indiana. We just recently celebrated this past year protecting over 100,000 acres within the state. And some of that's even agricultural lands. So how can we make those lands as resilient and profitable and functional as we can? Because there's multiple benefits for that. By incorporating soil health, you're building resiliency, you're improving water quality, there's a climate change benefit, there's ideally an economic benefit, there's ideally a yield benefit. But then also by taking the lands that are already in production and making them as productive as possible, there's also a reduced threat on the lands that the Nature Conservancy is working to protect and manage historically. So again, this is a picture of the Mississippi watershed. It's long been a priority water landscape for the Nature Conservancy. We've been working decades on restorations, habitat, reconnecting floodplains, and then also for protection of species. And in really over the last decade, we've started to move we've been very place-based historically, but if we're not involved in larger conversations about water quality or again, climate change, some of the reasons why we're protecting some of the watersheds, even right here in Indiana, we're not ultimately going to be successful. Some of our work here in Indiana has focused on tributaries of the Wabash and reintroducing and managing mussel species. If we're not having conversations about what's going on in that watershed, we will probably not be successful. If we're not having conversations about climate change and looking at the impacts that it will ultimately have to the Hoosier National Forest and many of the lands we're protecting in southern Indiana, that landscape is going to look different in 50 years. So how can we be working collectively with partners to address these changes proactively that need to be made? And so as we started looking at the Mississippi Basin, how could we be additive? How could we come in and support partners, organizations, and others that are doing great work already? We started trying to prioritize our work because, again, we don't have unlimited resources like everybody on the call or all of our organizations that we work for. So how can we target and work? And what this is showing is nutrient loadings to the Mississippi Basin. The black line, if you can just barely see it there on the outline, is largely the upper Mississippi River watershed. We've long had projects there, but what I want you to look at is the red. And what the red is, that's showing the nutrient loading. And this is a USGS map, a nutrient loading sourcing by watershed to the Mississippi Basin. And what I did is I borrowed, Randy had a slide where he was focused on the upper Midwest, looking at the high percentages of non-operating landowners areas. So I just carried his similar red ring through the slides I'm going to go through here quickly because it's actually really several maps. So if you look at that, the I states pop out. I don't think that's probably news to anybody in the state or anybody on the phone that these 3 states are all proactively working with state nutrient reduction strategies of how can they proactively and voluntarily solve the nutrient loading or the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force goal of reducing nutrient loading to the Mississippi Basin by 20% by 2025. So go ahead, Randy, you can advance. And so what's this looking at is then looking at what is the land use within that geography. If you look at that, you can see, again, looking at that same area, there's 39% of the corn yield by volume is produced in the 3 I states. So again, looking at Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. Hit it again, Randy. And then here is the same thing, but for the soybean side. So for soybean, if we can focus in on those 3 states, again, the I states, that would be 35% of the soybean yield comes just from those states. Hit it again, Randy. What this is, I borrowed this map from Dr. Joe Lauer up at University of Wisconsin. He was presenting at the Certified Crop Advisor meeting in Indianapolis last December, and I borrowed this slide. And what it shows is the percent of harvested land that's in corn and soybeans. And what it is most important is to hone in on the red counties. And so what those red counties are showing is 90 to 100% of the row crop acreage in those counties that's harvested is in corn and soybean. And why this is special to the freshwater team here in Indiana is we have a regional conservation partnership program with NRCS where we're working in Benton County. Benton County, Indiana, 95% of its land use is in row crop agriculture. And 90 to 100% of that 95% row crop agriculture is in corn and soybeans. And then if you look at Randy's map from previous two, over 60% of the acres in that watershed is operated by somebody who doesn't own it. So the non-operating landowners are a key component for us working in Indiana. And what's special about the Big Pine watershed, at the very base of that watershed is a nature preserve that the Nature Conservancy owned and manages, where we're trying to do mussel species augmentation, reintroducing mussels. And it is a jewel that looks like you're almost, I wouldn't quite say you're in Appalachia, but it is amazingly a carved out limestone wooded canyon at the base of a heavy used agricultural watershed. So for the lands we're trying to protect and preserve, it is key that we're working with agriculture, and it's key then that we're working with the non-operating landowners as well. And that's how TNC is plugging into this space, or why we are plugging into this space. Go ahead, Randy. So to recap, reiterate, and reemphasize, because I think that was one of our key takeaways from the research that Randy's team led up, is that 94% of non-operating landowners agree or strongly agree that their farmer makes good conservation decisions. And 87% of the non-operating landowners indicated through the research that they're committed to having a long-term relationship with their farmers. You know, lots of times it's a year-to-year agreement, but you know, it is decades, 10 to 20 at least, that they continue that relationship with the farmer. And so what we're working with, and especially with commodity organizations, and you can advance, Randy, is how do we empower the growers or the farmers across the 3 I states or across the country to have that conversation with their landowner about introducing conservation, because the landowner sees the farmer as the expert. Prior to coming over to the Nature Conservancy, I've been here for just over 3 years. I worked with our state corn and soybean organizations here in Indiana, and working with the farmer board members there and farmers across the state. They were already doing a lot of great efforts on those lands that they were farming, that they were renting from. But I know every single one of them that I would always talk to back then would always say they would even be willing to do more if they just knew that there was more of a future there, or that it would pay off. I think a big concern, especially with commodities as depressed as they are right now, with land prices, is there's always a concern of losing that land, and margins are pencil thin for farmers. So, they are very wise investors with their dollars. So, and conservation costs dollars or costs money to put up front, especially some of these practices will ultimately pay for themselves, but there is often an upfront cost. So how can we facilitate that conversation or advocate for that conversation to happen between the grower and their landowner? So what we did is Randy led up an effort across the I states this past year where we convened groups, and we had members from all the corn and soybean organizations in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana were represented. But we also brought in land use planners, we brought in attorneys, we brought in agribusiness council reps, we brought in the researchers, many of the key partners in all of the states about identifying what are unique opportunities we can do. This slide says just uniquely even in Indiana, but we were also looking at what are unique opportunities in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa as well. Doing shared learnings on, soil health efforts, how can we spread that information? And then one of the projects we're just getting ready to initiate now is a partnership with Iowa Corn Growers Association. And what we're working with is, they've got the trusted ear of the growers. So for those that maybe aren't fully familiar with the grower organizations is, every farmer that grows soybean pays into the soybean checkoff. Most farmers that grow corn pay into the corn checkoff as well. There's a few instances where farmers could opt out, but in most cases too, those organizations have a reputation where they have an 85 to 90% approval rating by the growers in each of those states. So they are well respected, well liked, and well received by the growers in those states. And what we're looking at is partnering with those organizations, since they've got the audience of the growers uniquely than any of the other partners, is developing messaging and providing information, resources, and tools that they can then provide to the growers and their members as well to ultimately make them successful. Because what we're looking at, if we've got a 20% nutrient reduction goal for the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River by 2025, it's not enough just to be working with farmers on their own private lands. How do we work with farmers that are renting as well to get conservation put in place on those ag lands? Because it's going to take us all working together to be successful to get towards those reduction goals. What we're not trying to do is, lots of times I would hear from some of the growers or grower organizations is TNC getting between the farmer and their landowner. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is champion that conversation actually needs to happen. And then also providing tools in partnership with the commodity organizations that they can offer to their members or offer to landowners as well as if they would like to use them. But really what we're advocating is that a conversation needs to happen.
Well, with that, then I would thank you both so much for not only this presentation, but also the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for your partnership with the Soil Health Partnership and the work that you do. To everyone on the call today, thank you for joining.